you say Python, what exactly goes behind the scene? So remember, I used the example of translator. Right? So think this is you, right? You speak English, and then you want computer to do some task for you. This is computer, and computer understands machine language. It is called machine language. Yeah, you understand English, computer understands machine language. So we come up with an intermediate, and we say, hey, we are gonna call this Python. So we learn Python. We learn the grammar, we learn the vocabulary, we learn the syntax of Python, so that we can give instructions to a computer. The point is, Python itself does not run on a machine language, on computer, because Python is still a text-based language. And it needs machine language. So Python has its, behind the scene, it has its own, what we call it, a compiler. Okay, that converts the Python code into machine language code and vice versa. Okay, so you heard the word compiler. In some language, they also call it interpreter. The job of this is also a software again. The compiler is converting your Python code into machine language and vice versa. So when you say Python, Python is a programming language, and each programming language has its own compiler, because the person who developed Python, who invented Python, wrote the compiler, because without which you can write all the syntax, you can come up with all the grammar and everything, but it's of no use, because somebody has to convert that code also into machine language, and that is what compiler does. What it means is, today you come up with a new language. Let's come up with a new language. You know, we'll call it Dev Plus. You know, we'll call it Dev Plus Plus. We'll name after Dev. So if you say Dev Plus Plus, the Dev Plus Plus language needs a compiler, because somebody who learns Dev Plus Plus he wrote the code in Dev Plus Plus, but then it's of no use unless Dev Plus Plus has a compiler that will convert the Dev Plus Plus code to machine language. You understand that? Because Python or Dev Plus Plus is still text-based. It's not machine language. Yeah, go ahead, Dev. You have a question?
Yeah, so I was just wondering, what's the difference between the compiler and translator?
So translator and umbrella word. There is nothing called translator in programming world. The two words that you will hear is what we call it compiler, and second what we call it interpreter.
Okay.
Both are loosely referred as, you know, translator. I mean, this is for your understanding, that you remember it. If you don't remember the word compiler, at least remember that there is somebody who is translating your Python code into machine language. Now you can, the right question to ask is, what is the difference between compiler and interpreter?
Yeah,
okay.
I think that's the question I meant.
Okay, so the difference is, you know, compiler compiles your code and keeps an intermediate version, and then it gives it to machine language. So think of this like, you know, before you make biryani, you have rice cooked already, you have chicken already cooked, and you're just going to mix and match and say, you know, everything is, there you go, there is your biryani. So you do some upfront task, you know, in advance, and keep it ready. So for example, Python creates an intermediate file called pyc. If you run any Python code, and you will see that it will create an intermediate file called pyc, which is an output of a compiler, and this is like keeping available that will be fed into machine language. So the advantage it is pretty fast, because you have already done some part of the work in advance before you are feeding it to a computer. On the contrary, an interpreter is on the fly. It doesn't do any groundwork. It doesn't do any intermediate work. I will listen. I'll give it to I will immediately convert line by line immediately into, you know, machine language. So you tell me one line, I'll convert that and send it to machine language. I will not do preparation. What I mean is, the compiler takes everything, prepares everything, and then feeds everything. So it does its own homework. Interpreter does not. Interpreter goes line by line. You tell me one line, I'll translate it. Next line, I'll translate it. What's the problem? If you write a mistake in third line, interpreter will not be able to catch unless you go to the third line. First two lines will not have problem. Compiler, since it does one bunch and takes whole code, if you write 10 instructions and you have a problem in third line of third instruction, compiler will say, I'm not going to send it to computer because third line has a problem. So compiler will complain and will stop. But interpreter will not stop. Interpreter will say line number 1, okay, there you go. He already fed it to computer. Line number 2, fed it. Or third line, there is a problem. Sorry, I can't do anything. I pause. You see the difference? One is on the fly, another is all taken in the bunch and then process it. Go ahead, Dave.
So it sounds like the compiler is better than the interpreter. So why would you be using an interpreter?
Good point. So some language comes with an interpreter. Some language has, like JavaScript doesn't have a compiler. JavaScript is on the fly. It has a interpreter. It has its own advantage because it's much faster. You're doing line by line. You're not taking any time to do the groundwork. But when it comes to running, then compiler is faster because compiler has already kind of semi-converted into machine language, if not fully. But it is the language. So today you write a new language, right? You can decide to write either compiler or interpreter. Depends on how you want to process this information, these set of instructions. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Good question. So this is how Python behind the scene works, and it's good for you to know because as I said, you understand now compiler, you understand now interpreter, you understand how Python works at a high level behind the scene. So when you write the code, you will be using Python compiler. Compiler will, if you look at 10, if you write 10 set of instructions, Python will complain saying the third has a problem. It won't run. It will stop. Make sense? Okay. Cool. What else we have? Let me think. So we talked about how computer runs. We talked about at a high level compilers, right? So there is a word called source code, right? The set of instructions that we give to a compiler or to computer is the instruction is called code, and a line of code you can write just one line of instruction. That's one line of code. The set of lines of code is what we call a computer program, and that code is called source code. Source code is the raw code that you wrote it, raw set of instructions in Python that you wrote it, and then that's get converted into Python compiler file, and that runs into machine and all. So anytime I use the word source code, I'm talking about the code you wrote it, code I wrote it, the raw plain vanilla code.